Rule 1 of filmmaking: give the audience what they want. Obviously, this means different things in different movies, and sometimes you need to make viewers wait a little while for that euphoric payoff, but sometimes the film leaves such a sour taste from the outset with fans. Fans who've paid their hard-earned money for the pleasure, no less, and that can taint the entire experience. As much as horror fans have a reputation for perhaps being more forgiving than fans of other genres, they're also some of the most passionate moviegoers you'll ever find, and won't hold back on letting loose when a film leaves them foaming with frustration. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 horror movies that pissed off audiences straight away. Number 10. Jason Gets Destroyed and Possesses People. Jason Goes to Hell: The Final Friday. Though fans' expectations were well and truly through the floor by the time the 9th Friday the 13th film materialized, they nevertheless reasonably assumed that the title character would stick around for his final movie. But instead, everybody's favorite machete-wielding maniac Jason Voorhees is effectively disposed of just 7 minutes into the movie, when the FBI springs a trap on Jason, which results in his body being explosively obliterated. And if that's not frustrating enough, a few scenes later we learn how a Friday the 13th movie can exist without Jason's corporeal form. The coroner performing Jason's autopsy finds himself compelled to eat Jason's still-beating heart. As a result, the coroner becomes possessed by Jason's spirit, and the majority of the movie involves Jason living on in the various human hosts he transports his soul between. Aside from a few glimpses of Jason in Reflections, we don't see the franchise's iconic character again in the flesh until the very end of the film. Number 9. It's Not Found Footage. Blair Witch 2: Book of Shadows. Book of Shadows: Blair Witch 2, helmed by veteran documentary filmmaker Joe Berlinger, ditches the found footage format of the first film and instead unfolds as a more conventional narrative feature. The movie's opening is pretty much a series of deflating revelations that steadily arrive one after another. For starters, the sequel takes place in a world where the Blair Witch Project movie exists, lending it a half-baked meta-narrative element that feels wildly at odds with the tone of the first film. Throw in an obnoxious host of new characters, plenty of awful dialogue, and you've got a disappointment stew cooking. This isn't to say that sequels can't deviate radically from their predecessors to great success, but the first 10 minutes made it painfully clear that all of this was not the correct course to go with. Number 8. Cotton's Death. Scream 3. The easiest way for any horror sequel to piss the fanbase off is to kill a popular and beloved character right off the bat, and that's exactly what Scream 3 did. In its pre-title sequence, fan-favorite anti-hero Cotton Weary is slaughtered by the new Ghostface killer, in what was presumably intended to be an all-bets-are-off mission statement, that anyone can die in this threequel, as Randy confirms via a videotape later on. In the end though, Scream 3 ended up just being far more of a conventional slasher sequel than any other film in the series to date, and so Cotton's upsetting demise ultimately didn't really feel like it was worth it. You can certainly appreciate Wes Craven wanting to veer away from the pre-title kill sequences of the first two films, centered around characters fairly unimportant to the main story as they were. But that initial heartbreak of Cotton's death never felt justified by anything that followed. Beyond Cotton being one of the series' most interesting characters, it doesn't help that his actual demise feels totally standard fare for the series. And it also introduces one of the silliest aspects of the entire franchise: Ghostface's new voice changer device, allowing him to sound like anyone. Number 7. The generic opening sequence. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 2010. Like any remake of a classic iconic horror film, 2010's A Nightmare on Elm Street was always going to face an uphill struggle to convince audiences that it's the real deal. And so it needed to come swinging out of the gate with an imaginative and unforgettable kill sequence which cemented the new Freddy as a true force to be reckoned with. Sadly, the remake opens with a glossy but atmosphere-devoid set piece in which Dean Russell has his throat cut by Freddy in a dream, while in reality Dean cuts his own throat in a diner. It's fittingly gory, but totally lacking in creativity, and really sets the tone for a remake that truly lacks any fresh ideas of its own. Compare this generic opening sequence to that of the 1984 original, which kicks off with Tina's moody nightmare before introducing us to the likable leads in an organic way. It then builds up Tina's iconic death scene, a scene that, while replicated later in the remake, isn't nearly as well executed. In the very least, Elm Street 2010 let fans know early on that they shouldn't expect much, beyond Haley's thanklessly committed performance, and maybe ensure that they still had time to crap a refund. Number 6. Detective Carey's unfair death. Saw 3. Though the third Saw film is actually surprisingly good, especially for the standards of horror threequels, it kicked off with a major bummer death that felt unearned in every which way. Barely 10 minutes into Saw, Detective Allison Carey, perhaps the most capable investigator following Jigsaw's trail in the first 3 movies, gets kidnapped and placed in one of his traps. The flimsy reason for Carey's kidnapping? She's too obsessed with her work, which is apparently a fitting rationale for hooking her ribs into a contraption which will rip them apart if she can't retrieve a key housed within a vat of acid. In a tense scene, Carey ends up grabbing the key, but gets cheated out of victory because, as we later learn, Jigsaw's apprentice Amanda rigged the trap to be unwinnable. As a result, Carey's ribcage is torn out of her body, killing her instantly. As shocking a moment as it was also a genuine downer for fans who felt that Carey was primed to become the series' new cop protagonist. Even if the writers were dead set on Carey's death, it would have been more gratifying if she'd made it to the end of the movie and fallen at the finish line, rather than getting chumped out in one of the film's very first scenes like a standard issue meat puppet. Number 5. Don makes a run for it. 28 weeks later. Unlike most of the examples on this list, this is a case of an opening sequence that pisses the audience off in a way that actually benefits the movie. 28 Weeks Later had the unenviable task of trying to match the visceral vision of Danny Boyle's original horror classic, and it swung laudably hard in its white-knuckle opening. The film begins with protagonist Don, his wife Alice, and a few other survivors holed up in a remote cottage. But terror soon strikes when a young boy seeking shelter brings with him a horde of the rage-infected, not zombies. With the infected swarming the cottage, Don urges Alice to leave the boy to his own devices, but when she refuses, Don decides to flee, saving himself while seemingly leaving both his wife and the boy to be killed. Though we later learn that Alice in fact survived the incident, it's an utterly gut-wrenching opening precisely because it forces us to condemn Don's behavior while also considering the likelihood that we'd do exactly the same thing, or at least an act of adjacent cowardice in his shoes. It pissed everyone off in the exact perfect way that the filmmakers intended. You hated Don in that moment, but understood him as a human being. Number 4. Veronica dies in childbirth. The Fly 2. And now we take a violent 180 to look at another opening scene that left fans absolutely fuming, and not in a good way. This sequel to David Cronenberg's masterful 1986 body horror classic The Fly was already skating on thin ice, given that neither Cronenberg nor Gina Davis, who played surviving heroine Veronica, opted to return. While in many ways a damned if you do, damned if you don't sequel, The Fly 2 did itself no favors by killing off Veronica, played here by Saffron Henderson, whose face is seen in just a few quick shots in the film's first 3 minutes. Literally, the opening scene depicts Veronica giving birth to her and Seth Brundle's mutant son, the shock of which also causes her death. Given that Veronica was the film's single emotional tether to the unexpectedly affecting events of the original film, offing her so cruelly and so quickly left fans with a majorly sour taste in their mouths from the outset. Number 3. All the Alice clones get wiped out. Resident Evil Afterlife. Having anything but low expectations for Paul W.S. Anderson's Resident Evil sequels was always foolish, but given that the third film Extinction ended by teasing that Alice would team up with a fleet of her own clones to take down Albert Wesker, it was tough not to be at least perversely intrigued. The fourth film Afterlife indeed kicked off with Alice and her clones assaulting Umbrella HQ, resulting in an absolutely hilarious assault of wonky VFX, ridiculous physics, and like a dozen versions of Alice kicking all kinds of ass, which personally I find delightful no matter how crazy it is. Sadly, this rib-tickling silliness was short-lived, as the opening set piece concludes with Wesker blowing up the Umbrella facility, and surprise surprise, the ensuing explosion kills all the Alice clones, leaving just the Alpha Alice alive. Considering that the primary appeal, perhaps the sole appeal even, of this particular movie was watching a team of Mila Jovovich slaying undead monsters, to dispense with all that in just 15 minutes was a crushing disappointment. Number 2. Retconning H20 and killing Laurie. Halloween Resurrection. few horror movies have so blatantly flipped the bird at fans than Halloween Resurrection, aka Halloween: The Search for More Money. The previous film, Halloween H20 20 years later, ended with the seemingly concrete demise of Michael Myers, as Laurie Strode decapitated him with a fire axe, which you think would get the job done. The film cut to black literally seconds later, appearing to offer up an emphatic "that's all folks" to a franchise that had been running on fumes for years and years. But Halloween being a horror franchise and all, it was never going to stay dead forever. And so Halloween Resurrection materialized a few years later. The film's spectacularly insulting opening sequence commits the offensive double whammy of effectively retconning H20's ending and killing off the series' beloved heroine. First off, it's revealed that Michael wasn't actually decapitated in H20, but rather he swapped clothes with a paramedic at the last minute and crushed his larynx so that he couldn't tell Laurie who he was. Number 1. The original is totally ignored. Brahms The Boy 2. Brahms The Boy 2 truly is one of the strangest horror sequels in recent memory. The original movie wasn't great, but at least it had a few effective scares and delivered a genuinely amusing final plot twist. Though The Boy led audiences to believe that the pallid porcelain doll Brahms was possessed and behind the movie's increasingly sinister series of events, the ending revealed that it was actually the real Brahms responsible, who, contrary to reports of his death, was now living in the walls of the Heelshire mansion as an adult. While the film ended with Brahms wounded, it was heavily implied that he survived, only for The Boy 2 to effectively retcon the entire story by conveniently forgetting this. The Boy 2 pointlessly pivoted back to focus again on the whole possessed doll angle, which the first film cleverly subverted, while the real Brahms was nowhere to be seen. Any promise the original movie had is more or less suffocated beneath both the pointless retcons and snooze-inducing character drama. It's all downhill from the first scene, really.